Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Passive House podcast. I'm Zach Semke coming to you from Seattle, Washington, and Matthew isn't here today, but we are joined by Mary, James, and Ilka Cassidy. Mary, how's it going?
It's fine. We have a atmospheric river blowing through, but so far so good.
So it's wet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How about you, Ilka?
Well, Philadelphia is doing well, very well indeed. We're all green.
Yes. Yes, it was quite a weekend last weekend. That was pretty monumental thromping.
Yeah. There's a big parade tomorrow. And yeah, Philly is green.
That's exciting. Did you watch the game?
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
Cool.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, we've got a great interview that you both conducted with Michael Marsh of Sidekick Architecture. He's based in Los Angeles, and it's a great conversation that delves into ADUs and sufficiency and fire resistance, passive house in a mild climate that's also prone to devastating fires, as we've just seen. So it's going to be a great episode. But before we dive in, I need to thank the fine organizations that make our work possible here at the Accelerator, including this Passive House podcast. So a big thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Ingwe Architecture, Partel, Rockwell North America, and Zola Windows. And thanks to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Cascadia Windows and Doors, European Architectural Supply, Thacro, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, and Source 2050. So, Mary, how did you connect with Michael?
Well, it was during a Passive House Accelerator live event, and he mentioned something in the chat about having a couple of clients already for rebuilds in the LA area. And of course, that caught my interest. So I reached out to him, and yeah, it led to this interview.
Awesome. Why don't we get straight into it then?
Welcome to the Passive House podcast. We're here today with Michael Marsh, principal of Sidekick Architecture, which is based in Los Angeles. Michael, could you please tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in Passive House?
Sure. Yeah. I grew up in Northern Virginia in a small town west of DC, and kind of have fond memories. My dad was the mayor of our town, and so he kind of made what was happening his business. And so my first kind of exposure to architecture was driving around the county and visiting houses that were under construction, often after the workers had left for the day of dubious legality, and would just poke around and see what it was like as just a young kid. And that was a lot of fun for me. When I got to the point of college, I decided I wanted to explore architecture, and I ended up studying at the University of Virginia, and was certainly interested in new modern architecture, but also balancing that with kind of the rich history of architecture. I ended up going into taking some time off between undergrad and graduate school, and did a master's program and studied got a Master of Architecture and a Master of Science in Historic Preservation. So I've kind of, depending on whether I've been living in New York or in Southern California, the historic preservation has a variety of kind of relevance, but oftentimes I'm doing only new modern things. Sometimes I get to work on adaptive reuse projects or kind of making relevant old structures again, and that's a lot of fun for us. And yeah, that's what we do. Now my wife and I started Sidekick Architecture a few years ago after working for other firms for quite a while. And one of the things we're really interested in currently is accessory dwelling units. So the laws in California have made it possible for a lot of people in single family residences to be able to build additional small houses anywhere from 400 square feet to 1,200 square feet, often in their effectively their backyard. And we think that's just a really great thing in terms of addressing the housing crisis, but it's also an investment that kind of pays good returns for our homeowners. So in addition to sort of a normal fully custom architecture practice, we also have started a semi-custom accessory dwelling unit program with a range of designs from extra small to extra large, the relevant term, and just kind of designs that floor plans that work well for most lots in Los Angeles that can then be adapted for different materials and features to more harmoniously work with the existing residents. So that's a little of what we're doing.
It's really interesting right now in Los Angeles in terms of ADUs and also fire resistance, because I live in California also, and certainly ADUs are such a great solution to our housing crisis to try and make better use of the existing built environment. But I was wondering, in terms of passive house, in your climate down there in Los Angeles, I would think there's a lot of your clients who aren't interested in energy efficiency per se.
Right.
And I just wonder how you deal with that, how you bring an interest in efficiency to your clients and make that relevant for your climate.
It's certainly a struggle here, especially. So I'm licensed as well in Virginia, where I grew up, and in New York State as well. Here, you've hit the nail on the head. It's such a mild and forgiving climate that it's often a hard sell to convince homeowners that they should invest a little bit more, because they just don't see it as a huge expense to heat and cool their homes in the way that you would in a more extreme climate. And I don't really quite have the answer. It is a battle often, and not always a battle that we win. I'm fairly new in the passive house world. I've been monitoring it for a while, but I'm just going through FIA's training for CPHC right now. So I'm kind of early in that stage. I think, especially with some of the fire rebuilds now, I think that's opening up a new window for certain solutions that can work to address the energy performance, but also the fire concerns. So for example, we're very intrigued in detailing into our assemblies continuous mineral wool or stone wool exterior insulation to wrap the entire outside of the sheathing, inside of the cladding. And that seems to be, we're still doing some research, but it seems that it would provide a lot of additional fire resistance in addition to energy performance and thermal resistance. So we're trying to just get to the point where this is our standard assembly. It's not really a question. If we're going to rebuild these houses, we have to allow for this extra space and the extra cost of doing that. And I think, it's clear if you can hold the attention span of homeowners for long enough, that the return on the investment, even in our climate, I think makes sense in the long run in terms of the life cycle cost.
So, and then a little bit more specific, where do you really see the value of passive house in an area like, California or Los Angeles area?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of clients, and we're always trying to push the narrative further, but I think a lot of clients understand that our climate now is not necessarily where it's going to be in 5, 10, 20 years. I think I believe that any house that we're building now should at least last 100 years, if not much longer. And so I think we have to, we have in the profession, we have a job to convince our clients that they shouldn't just be looking at today's conditions, today's financial situation, but architecture is inherently kind of a prediction machine, right? We have to build and design now in ways that will work for 100 years. And so I think we have some work to do in terms of convincing clients, but it's work that we must do.
And I would think it's selling fire resistance is a pretty easy sell right now. And I think you said you've already got a couple of clients who are, need to do, unfortunately, rebuilds.
Yes. Right.
Based on the recent fires.
Right.
I just was wondering how much fire resistance, it seems to me obvious that they would be interested in a rebuild that addresses fire resistance, but maybe it's not so obvious.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there too. So it's been very interesting. We're actually working on two projects, one in the Palisades and one in Malibu, cantilevering over the ocean. And it's not always playing out the way that you might expect. So both of these people had a complete loss as a result of the fire. So we're building from scratch. It's rubble. There's really nothing. And arguably even the sort of pile foundations, because of the heat exposure and the rebar, will have to be completely redone. And each of them have processed it in ways that we might not have predicted. So in the one case, the Malibu project, our client is an elderly woman who has some health ailments, and she had actually lived through a fire before and her current house she bought after a prior fire had burned down her house. She, because of her age and just, I think, some of the trauma of that, when she first engaged with us, and we're doing this in consultation with another firm, Paul Davis Architects, her mission to us was, don't worry too much about that, because I won't live long enough to worry about another fire. And I think some of that is just how we process something like going through that. Some of that's just that, the denial and that kind of processing of going through an experience like that. In another case, in the Palisades project, it was a very wealthy area. We may be able to get the original blueprints because it was just a 20-year-old house, and they still want to make strategic changes. But in both cases, we haven't yet seen a full embrace of fire resistance. And I think in some respects, there are some random scattered houses that survived in these areas, but it's not yet clear that it was the construction, the nature of the construction, that saved those houses as opposed to just luck. And so I think the hard truth that we have to face is it is very important, especially when we have the opportunity to build from scratch, to do all that we can to maximize the chance of these structures being salvageable, but more importantly, the life safety aspect of this. But there's also a question that we have to face, that in some of these places, these houses are just built so close to each other that it may not be enough to do that, and that's a hard truth. But there's a part of this that does it make sense to build back at the same density in areas that are prone to fire as we did before, and certainly we should do all that we can, but we also have to face the fact that, for example, I was at the Disaster Recovery Center in the weeks following the fires and talking to some Los Angeles Building Department staff members. And I was asking about what we do with fire rebuild regulations when we had non-conforming setbacks before. So the state regulations are saying that they can build back what they had before, but in some cases that might be a 4-foot side yard setback as opposed to, say, a 6-foot side yard setback. And I said, will they honor that, or will they enforce the current setbacks? And the guy sort of looked at me and said, do you really think 1 foot would have made a difference for these houses? And, that's kind of an eye-opening realization, right? That we have to be aware of the magnitude of the problem that these structures could be facing. And that even if we give it our best shot, that may not be enough, just because of the nature of how these houses are configured and the density.
Yeah,
part of the challenge.
That's really interesting. I'm from an area here in Philadelphia where I don't really have, fortunately, so far, I haven't had to think about fire safety at all in terms of wildfires. But I'm curious, like going through the FIAS training and just going through, having to rebuild houses that burned down because of the fire. Is there a different way to look at the detailing? Is there a way, where you personally think, okay, maybe if I do this, if I use a different material, or, layer the wall a little bit differently, that would make it a little bit more fire resistant? And then I guess the second part of that question is, are there any contradictions then between something that FIAS, for example, teaches which is a lot about moisture management in walls? Is there a contradiction between fire safety and moisture management?
Yeah, I mean, they're not exactly the same project, but I think there's some overlap that's helpful. So I mentioned the stone wool exterior insulation. I think that's kind of a win-win on both fronts, right? And it's a pretty easy sell. I mean, I think roughly there's 2 inches of, say, rock wool, mineral wool, comfort board 80, the rigid exterior stuff, is about $10 a square foot. And so, that's in the scope of a full rebuild project, that's a pretty modest additional investment, and that would perform in both ways. I think there's other questions too. in Los Angeles, we had these high fire severity zone regulations that were already sort of requiring, as part of permitting, some measures, things like closed eaves and defensible space, that those kinds of measures that, these kinds of things have been thought about and explored just through ordinances and regulation and code for quite a while in some of these areas. So, I think broadly what we need to do is expand the zone, even if we're not required to necessarily follow those measures, to understand that, fires aren't contained just to the areas that are flagged in zoning as fire prone areas anymore. Those areas will expand. But I think, we actually spend a whole lot of time thinking about the details of eaves and rakes and those kinds of things, those kind of corners of the building envelope. And I don't have all of the answers yet, but I think some of the details we've been working at are trying to think through all of these things together without losing the aesthetics and the charm and the detailing that people respond to. Because ultimately, we certainly like to nerd out on these details and the performance, but a lot of clients, of course, they want it to look nice and they want it to be affordable. So it's all of these things that need to be balanced together. But the kind of standard building envelopes and rake and eave details that we're starting to focus in absolutely have to do with wrapping generally 4 inches of stone wool above the roof sheathing on the roof, and then down to 2 inches on the walls, and then working through the eave details. We like doing an over roof detail so that we have our water resistant barrier and our air resistant barrier down at the structural sheathing, and then we do kind of fake rafter tails above that surface with an over roof. And that lets us have a vented over roof assembly, but without risking, every single rafter poking through our air and water resistant barriers. And so those are the details we're exploring and putting a lot of attention into that. And I think that can give us the kind of charming look and, like, say, a craftsman style aesthetic, but in a very high performance way that kind of, feels great. And then we also, on the inside, we can do tongue and groove kind of in lieu of drywall. And if we wanted to transfer where the beams would have been down with faux beams, but they correspond to the actual structural rhythm of the building. So we could basically recreate the exact look of, say, a craftsman interior and exterior, but in a very high performance way with really just a little bit of additional cost and a little bit of additional thickness in the assemblies.
So you mentioned that you have a vented roof and walls, which is great, right?
Mm-hmm.
But is that something that does not work that well with fire safety?
Yeah, and again, a lot of these we're going to need to test out now with a more attention on the fire aspect of it. But in my mind, at least, if you kind of have seen some of these videos of fire tests for, say, rock wool, stone wool insulation, it can withstand, I think, up to 2150 degrees Fahrenheit of fire, direct flame. And so in these scenarios, if you're continuously wrapping roof and walls with this, I think you could almost imagine that the cladding, and depending on what your over roof finish is, that's almost like a sacrificial layer that would have to get replaced. But by enveloping the primary structural envelope in this rock wool or stone wool or mineral wool, you are basically preserving what's inside of that. And then it's a more modest, cost that you're kind of redoing the finishes as opposed to the entire structure. There's still real questions about what happens with windows, right? I mean, if a window breaks from the heat, even if the structure survives, the smoke damage is quite extensive. So it's not bulletproof, but it's, I think, a good measure and certainly a good return on the investment, both in terms of the fire resistance and the energy performance.
You brought up windows, and I'm curious whether in Los Angeles, my understanding from what I've read about fires, that it's the glass that breaks before the frames. Mm-hmm. Generally speaking. And of course, one solution is tempered glass, and another solution is to go to triple pane because there's more layers there. And I just wondered if you've thought about those two solutions or other solutions, or whether you have window frame considerations that your clients would be more interested in. How are you dealing with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Triple pane is kind of a non-starter here. I mean, even in sort of passive house training, this is not the climate where that's worth the investment. So I've never worked on a project that's called for triple pane, and so I think that would be a hard sell. When it comes to windows here, our code, we call it Title 24, but our energy performance code is ever increasing and getting closer aligned to what we want to do in terms of just good solid building. So some of that solves itself just by, you have to have quite energy efficient windows. On the fire resistance, a lot of the windows, there's very careful rules about when you need tempered or safety glass in these windows anyway. So, and it, of course, is an additional cost for tempered glass. But I think generally dual pane IGUs that have good SHGC and U factor ratings that, really just even meeting code minimum gets us pretty close because code has become so robust here. And I think certainly that having tempered glass, but voluntarily upgrading to tempered glass, maybe in all windows, makes a lot of sense from a fire standpoint.
How about the frame? Is there like a preference in like material there?
We've had a lot of discussion about that. So in the immediate wake of the fires, there was questions about if we should be kind of aligning more like we'd see in New York with metal studs instead of wood frame studs. I'm not yet convinced that the gauge of metal it just isn't going to suffer from the heat of a fire if we get to that point. So I haven't yet sold myself that radical changes in kind of the actual structural systems is warranted yet, that there's going to be a return on the investment for that. Other things have been explored, like alternate sheathing, like magnesium panels and things that give you the shear strength, but with extra fire resistance. I guess when it comes to all of those things, I'm somewhat kind of haunted by images I've seen from prior fires long before this, houses that were built of concrete, and you see them standing afterwards, but then you look a little closer and you realize their roofs were not built of concrete, they were built of wood, and so the fire just came in through the roof. So while the sort of cell is still there, it's effectively a total loss. So there's a sweet spot of not missing the forest for the trees, right? Not going to great measures to have the walls remain if everything else is. And I come back to, in the same way that with thermal and air resistance and water resistance, we have to just be really continuous, create a balloon of isolation between indoor and outdoor. I think the same idea is going to hold true for fire. We have to find a way that we have a continuous treatment, roof, walls, and in some cases foundation or flooring, that is enveloping these things and just giving us our best chance of survival.
And I'm curious whether having an airtight home, because of just air quality issues in the face of smoke events or any other air quality issues, is becoming an easier sell there.
Yeah, and it's still in the early days, so we'll have to see when we get to that point. We're still in kind of the schematic design on these new projects. But anecdotally, we know people who lost their homes in the fire, and we know people who didn't lose their homes in the fire, but are looking at a year or more just in terms of the smoke damage and the unhealthy air. So just, conceptually, a lot of those, they might have had a traditional chimney, and so even if everything was fine, just the smoke in the air came through the chimney, right? So I think that the passive house measures that just are ruthless about, in a great way, about air barrier, air separation, are really helpful when it comes to that, because effectively I imagine you're able to basically just shut up your house as you evacuate in a situation like this, and really keep the indoor air separate from the outdoor air, which, aside from the actual loss from fire, is really helpful if you can get back quicker into your home, because the air inside is okay. So I think the indoor air quality benefits of passive house building are almost by themselves worth it. It's certainly for families with asthma conditions and those kinds of things, but really for all of us. I mean, it just feels great to have clean air, and it's just worth it to be able to bring in fresh ventilation in a controlled manner, and so I think that's an added benefit.
Right.
It remains to be seen if we can sell our clients on that aspect of it. But, I think, just if I could go a little bit further, I think part of what I think we should be trying to do as an industry, construction and design, is almost not making it a question, but just our standard way of building, right? I mean, I think that's where we want to get to, where whether or not our clients are asking for it, we know that there's a return on the investment here, and this is just how we build. And I think the more that the profession chooses to present it that way, is just really the right way to do it, rather than just building the worst house that you can build, the code minimum house. That it's just, if you're going to go through the trouble of building a house, you should build it to last, and to make it healthy air, and to not hemorrhage electrical usage, and it's just the right way to build.
Right. I just, part of the reason why I brought that up is I know that in Los Angeles, because the climate is so mild, that a lot of people are much more focused on indoor, outdoor, connections
Yeah.
and leaving windows open all the time. And so for them, having an airtight house might be a real foreign concept. But then again, I also know I have friends who live in LA who have terrible allergy issues. And for them, having an airtight house is super important. So I was
Yeah.
just curious whether you were getting feedback about that.
Yeah, well, and there's times even, we're in Marina Del Rey, and so we never need air conditioning. We don't have it. We have one that we haven't, a standalone that we haven't turned on in 3 years. But when it's in the kind of winter months, it gets cold here. We get the ocean air, and so there's plenty of times when we'd love to just kind of have fresh air, and we're not worried about that. But then there are times when the electric bill gets huge in the winter months because the heating is not efficient, and we need a lot of it. So even in our climate, I think there's times where you wouldn't want to just leave your windows open, and that you would very much like to control and have lower energy costs associated with conditioning the space.
So one thing that you brought up a little earlier was this image about the concrete houses still standing after the fire. And I feel like that was an image that just came up again after this round of fire. And it's just, we've been working so hard on making or creating awareness of embodied carbon, right? And that concrete might not be the best solution in terms of embodied carbon. And then when I started seeing these images and people are like, oh, we need to build in concrete, it's like, this is not this is not good. Where do you see this kind of almost contradiction going? Where do you see, I mean, you said it's even if something is built out of concrete, if the flames come in through the roof, it doesn't matter. So I think that's a really good perspective that people don't always kind of consider, or even just the damage by all the smoke that you can't really live in that house afterwards anyway. So I think that's probably a good point to not build like that or out of concrete. But there are other materials like mass timber that is actually very good with fireproof building, and that could be built roof, walls, and all the way around. Do you see any kind of traction in that direction?
Yeah, it's I've done so many webinars about mass timber construction, and I think it's really exciting. I think it's great that building code is starting to incorporate it more and more so people become more aware of it. I saw it firsthand on the Malibu project. We just recently were able to kind of get to the site, and even now contractors aren't really able to, but we can get around some of that if we kind of jump in the car with the homeowners, because homeowners have access to these sites. But walking down the beach in Malibu, and to compare it from our memories of what these houses kind of dangling over the Pacific Coast Highway used to be like, and now is really quite alarming. But one thing that's very interesting is one of the few things that remain basically unscathed is a lot of these seawalls were built of essentially just stacked kind of railroad ties, and just the sheer thickness of this wood. They're charred, but they're there. And it reminded me in some of the mass timber projects that I've seen kind of really carefully explained and detailed, there's like a char layer associated with mass timber. And so you just need to oversize it, knowing that a certain portion will burn, but that what will remain and not burn is structurally sound. And so I think that has a lot of potential. It is still back to the question of if before the fires, it was a bit of a hard sell to convince clients to spend 5% more or 6% more on their project to get to a passive house standard as opposed to code minimum. It's going to be a while before those kinds of newer, more kind of foreign approaches to construction, non-traditional approaches to construction, kind of take hold in among laymen and clients as something that they're looking for. I do think that the more that we see that those kinds of structures can be win-wins in terms of surviving events like this, being sustainable, low carbon approaches, if we can also get to the point where they're also cost effective to build and people recognize them as such, then I think they'll take hold. But like anything else, there's a period of exploring and optimizing in order to get to the point where it makes sense. And our industry, of course, is very, very slow. certainly the construction industry, but also the design industry, we are inclined to do things the way they've been done for the last 50 years. So it's a slow burn to get people to start to adapt to new ways, and it takes a lot to do it. But I think when we hit a tipping point, people see these alternates as viable, then I think it becomes very exciting. And the only way to get there is for more and more people in the industry to kind of say, here's another way of doing it. And here are the numbers, the math, the logic behind why this makes sense as a return on investment equation, in addition to the right thing to do for broader ways.
I feel like I don't want to pretend that any of us have all the answers about what's the best fire resistant assemblies, but I do think
Right.
it on the minds of, or I'd be shocked if it wasn't on the minds of most people working in California these days in the architecture and construction industry. And I was just thinking while you were talking about at a recent webinar, I heard that the mission style architecture came into being as a response to attacks by basically people trying to set buildings on fire by throwing fire bombs at them. I mean, not bombs, but
Sure.
And so as you were talking about roof construction, I was thinking about, well, stucco with the kind of tiles, the mission tiles that are well known in California, and was thinking about that. And I was wondering if you've had any thoughts about that kind of construction approach.
Yeah. And you mean like the clay roof tiles?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, I think that's great if the underlying structure remains intact, right? I mean, if the roof sheet, and certainly as you kind of this Malibu project I mentioned, a lot of these were kind of Spanish style, mission style projects, but they're gone. And you can find these clay tiles in the rubble, and they're okay, but the entire kind of structure that supported them is gone. So, they're really it's like a vulnerability question, right? I mean, we have to kind of isolate everything, and sure. I mean, there are fire ratings for asphalt shingles, clay tiles. Those things can survive these fires, but we have to make sure that the thing supporting them survives them first. And in other cases, I do think at a minimum to identify a line between what's potentially sacrificial in a fire event and what we really don't want to lose is important. Yeah. So that's but that's an interesting bit of history on that mission style.
Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting to think of it as what's sacrificial and what isn't. And sorry, again, decking and fencing, such a big issue for people because emotionally people are very attached to their decking, their deck experiences here in California. But at the same time, as I understand it, that's a big issue for fire resistance because, decks are attached to the building and can lead a fire right up to the building.
Right.
I wondered if this is an issue that you've, are dealing with.
Yeah, I come back to that story of at the disaster relief center. It's the building official kind of wondering, if we don't lose the forest for the trees in some of these respects. So I think I'm not sure that a house with no deck would have survived, whereas a house with a deck did not in these particular events. And so, I think that's where I come down to this idea of having a line sort of where we start our scope of work of fire resistance. And I think that certainly should include the actual structural system and of course everything inside of that boundary. I think there's this concept of defensible space here in these high fire zones where we want, through landscaping and other measures, we want to keep fire at bay if it's in the neighborhood. But in some cases, of course, when your neighbor is 8 feet, 10 feet away from you, that's out the window, right? Whatever you're doing in your front yard, your side yard is going to be the problem. And so I think, we're gonna have to sort through how we handle that.
So we have only talked about new build, right? Basically, how about existing or historic renovations? I mean, that's something that you have been doing as well, or very knowledgeable in. So is that like how's the fire resilience response there? Is that different?
Yeah, so we don't have any specific projects that where there's an addition to a house that survived yet. I think, I think in the same way, there's always this question: if you have an existing, say, historic house, and by the way, I didn't mention this, but in non-fire zones, a lot of areas where we look at projects are in historic preservation overlay zones, and we would, even if we're doing a kind of vast, renovation, or maybe even like a back to stud type thing, and a portion of the house, the HPOZ, the historic preservation overlay zone, will prohibit us from kind of messing with the original fabric, right? And so, and the same true for energy performance, and I assume also with fires. But you could build the most sound building assembly, wall and roof assembly for your addition, but the lowest common denominator is going to be those original walls, where you can't remove the stucco because it's a historic, or there's just no budget to do that. And so even all your air and thermal loss going to be through that original fabric. So that's a real question, right? I mean, on the one hand, as an industry, we have to deal with the fact that we can't just do new perfect builds for everybody. That's not cost effective, and there's enough need already that we have to make use of the existing housing stock. But a lot of that housing stock was built in our area in the 50s, and back in Virginia, 1780, 1800 sometimes. So it's just a different nature of construction. And I think there is no kind of one size fits all solution. We have to, on a case by case basis, measure what's the right amount of effort to put into this given these situations. As a slight sidebar, I've been kind of reaching out to Mayor Karen Bass's office and really kind of suggesting that one thing that I think would make a huge difference, and I felt this way before the fires, is if we could get zoning to have a specified exception when it comes to side yard setbacks for the purpose of adding continuous rigid exterior insulation of, say, 2 inches. So a lot of times we have projects where people are already going back to studs with their renovation. That's a major remodel, but they can't afford the loss of setback to put that extra 2 inches into their assembly. And that's just crazy, right? Because the setback is about fire resistance to your neighbor. And so the idea of having 2 inches less setback for the benefit of having fire resistant material put into that assembly just makes sense. So I think there's, at some point, kind of getting through some of the bureaucracy on things like this, things that are just logical and make sense, is a powerful thing that we could do, and that the planning department and zoning could evolve to recognize that there are some times where exceptions like this would make sense.
Yeah, and I believe that's what happened in New York as well with the setbacks. And it wasn't about fire safety, but about energy efficiency, being able to put that exterior insulation in place in order to get more efficient buildings. Yeah.
We worked on a project a while ago where we couldn't do that. They desperately wanted better thermal performance, and the only option was to cut holes from the inside, because they couldn't mess with the outside, into the drywall and do loose fill or dense pack insulation into the stud bays. And that's just wild. I mean, they would have loved to have just kind of handled all of that thermal envelope on the exterior of the sheathing. It would have been easier for everybody. The inside could have remained intact, but we couldn't afford the loss and setback.
And going back to ADUs, which is, as you said, something else that you specialize in, it seems like a lot of ADUs may have these setback conflicts, especially if you want to add that insulation on the outside. Has that been an issue for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of times it's kind of it's strange. If you have a non-conforming condition on, say, your garage, and you're going to convert your garage, that's allowed to remain in place. Any addition you do to that, and normally it's hard to kind of make these plans work, or at least in our experience, we usually have some kind of additional construction involved, and that has to be fully compliant. So now you have to have the 4-foot side and rear yard setbacks, and so you end up kind of having these kind of inside and outside corners to make these things work. But surely, if there was a 6-inch or an 8-inch setback instead of a 4-foot setback on an existing garage, I'm not convinced the city would allow us to reduce that by another 2 inches to wrap this in rigid exterior insulation. And that's back to my last comment. That's something that they should reconsider. It's worth the loss of 2 inches in order to get a better building envelope.
The last question for me: you are talking about all these restrictions and code, and there's something else that you always have to consider, which is seismic, right? Does that contradict with any of what we're just talking about?
We work with structural engineers for everything when it comes to that sort of thing. Conceptually, that really comes down to having shear panels, or when we have big openings, we have big steel moment frames that are meant to resist the lateral forces at work with seismic. I don't think it needs to stand in the way of anything. I mean, fundamentally, it's, in the case of shear panels, it's the same, often half-inch sheathing on the outside. It's just a different nailing pattern and some hold downs on the inside. But what I see as, in terms of energy performance and fire resistance, is outbound of that layer. So I don't think we need to really fundamentally reconsider the actual structural situation that's been working well. And you know, the seismic codes are quite robust, and as they should be. But everything I think we're talking about here can happen just as easily with, you know, proper shear panels as, you know, as if you did not have those, because it's happening in simply outbound of that sheathing.
And my final question is about landscaping issues, which may not be anything that you deal with, that, you know, your firm may not deal with that. But as you did mention, the 5-foot zone closest to your house is a high fire hazard to address. And I just wonder if that's come up with your clients, you know, particularly these ones during the rebuild, although I understand that at least one of your clients probably isn't that interested in those kind of issues, but
yeah,
is that something you're facing?
Yeah, so we already had, it's called Muello, but we had water ordinance calculations that were already steering a lot of these projects into more kind of zero-scaping, drought-tolerant planting, and a lot of times decomposed granite, that kind of thing in these landscapes. And a lot of people, you know, a lot of people don't want to be wasting water watering grass, even if they were allowed to do that. And in some of these cases, that has already been addressed by just the various ordinances that are in place. But again, it's like that works when you have a very large lot to have defensible space. But in the Palisades Village, for example, that wouldn't have helped, right? Because the structures were just simply too close, and the heat was too high, and the duration was too long. So again, those are, it's not that we shouldn't be thinking about those. We definitely should, and when we can, we should definitely implement those as part of our toolkit. It's just not going to be the primary solution. It's going to be one of many solutions that we have to address. And all of this, of course, it has to be balanced with, we all have our idea of what a home is and what our yard is. And for some people, that's the white picket fence. And in the case of our Malibu client, that's cantilevering over the Pacific Ocean. We have to be cautious of winning the battle, but losing the war in the industry, right? So, I mean, we have to balance the vision and the dream that our clients have with what's practical and can basically what we can get the most bang for our buck when it comes to these measures. And that's true for their investment, their financial investment, but also our approaches to dealing with both energy performance and fire resistance. It's a case-by-case basis, and we have to deploy the right tools for that particular project.
And I said it was my last question, but I have to go back to ADUs for a minute. You mentioned earlier that you live in a relatively small house or compact house for your family, and there is a skill to designing so that small spaces don't feel small.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit about some of your insights gained during your ADU work.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think I would just say broadly, it's very interesting when you kind of deal with a range of clients, from sort of like young clients that are maybe just about to start their family, and then kind of elderly clients that are long past empty nesting, but there's this funny situation in kind of American culture where we start out, you know, kind of maybe right out of college, and we just need a little studio apartment wherever we are. And then we kind of, our space needs, or our perceived space needs, kind of balloon. And we have kids, and we've got to have billiards rooms and those kinds of things. But then eventually those kids go off onto their own, start their own families, and you start to really have a big house that you have to maintain, you have to vacuum, and you have to pay energy bills for. And so, you know, your spatial needs really start to contract, both perceived and actual needs, right? And so I think one of the sweet spots we have to find is sort of finding something that's going to work for clients through a variety of stages, right? And I think one of the keys to making small spaces feel bigger than they are is whenever possible, we love to vault the ceiling. That works very well with some of the passive house detailing because we can put that thermal envelope up in the rafter bay, and we can use some of these assemblies like the over roof assembly. And then we don't need to have kind of a flat ceiling in an attic space. If we do have an attic space, we can use that for HVAC systems and not have loss through the ducts because it's all in the conditioned envelope. But strategically, we can pop that up and see that what clients love to see, which is sort of that more craftsman style vaulted ceiling with the tongue and groove and the beams. And that's a really wonderful thing in a small space. And it's kind of quite amazing, even in like a garage conversion with no addition, how different it feels when you have that higher ceiling. I think having good light through windows makes a huge difference, and ideally energy high performance windows for thermal comfort and reduced energy costs. And I think generally just being very thoughtful and strategic about how the space plan works, right? I mean, oftentimes you don't need all kinds of stuff in your bedroom. Your bedroom is kind of for sleeping, right? And you need a dresser and a closet, but kind of favoring more the living spaces, the kitchen spaces, and doing just what you need in the bedroom is a way to kind of make these spaces kind of breathe and feel bigger than they are. And so we have a lot of fun kind of steering around, working within the constraints of a relatively small footprint. And even if it's a brand new ADU and they want to go the maximum size, which in Los Angeles is 1,200 square feet, that's you can maybe get 3 bedrooms in there, but that's a really great 2-bedroom, maybe 2-bath size to work with. And you can have spaces that feel not like a little kind of backyard house, but like a real house. And so there's a lot of tricks, and it depends on the client's program and their budget, but there's a lot of opportunities here for these things to not feel like sort of just little kind of shed conversions, but to feel like wonderful homes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And, it's great to get a perspective because all of us are dealing with a changing climate and a changing landscape that we're working in. So it's great to hear from you.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate really looking at all these different perspectives and seeing what works together and what doesn't. And you always have to figure something out in between. Yeah, no, I think this was a very great conversation. Thank you so much.
Sure. And I'm just having so much fun becoming more and more a part of this community of kind of passive house folks. And I'm learning all the time through various avenues, but I think it's really exciting, right? Because I think we have the potential to kind of steer the direction of where we go in terms of how we build. And I'm very excited to join this cause. So.
Okay, so that was Michael Marsh. Great conversation. Mary and Ilka, thank you so much for making that happen. Ilka, you want to start with your takeaways and impressions?
Yeah, so for me, it was really interesting just talking about the whole topic of fire resiliency, something that I haven't had to deal with, unfortunately. And just thinking about all the things that you might be able to do, but at the end, how you were saying, you have to really think about if the way everything was built before the fires, if that is the way it should be rebuilt, even in terms of distance between the houses, setbacks, and the whole zoning. I'm sure that's not going to change very quickly. I'm sure all those houses and those lots, and it's probably very unrealistic to think that it's going to completely change and rezoned differently. But to really attack this or address this issue, you have to look at a bigger picture. And I feel like he kept saying that it's not just about, materials. I mean, it might help definitely, but it's a lot about just the position of where the houses are in relationship to each other, and, just really thinking about what the force of these fires are.
Yeah, right. And it brings up a tension, right? As we think about how to create cities that are resilient to climate change, but also don't exacerbate climate change. The last thing we want to do is make sprawl even worse by having even less density in these areas that are part of the wildland urban interface. It's tricky stuff. How about you, Mary?
Well, it really brought up for me how much of an evolving field this is, because, is it luck? Is it how much of a house not burning is luck, or is how the
Mhm.
structure was constructed? It's still very, something we're all trying to figure out in real time. And I love when he said architecture is a kind of prediction machine.
Uh,
Because it is like we're all trying to figure out in real time how to adapt to how the climate has changed already and is going to be still changing.
right. And there's a degree where we can do the best we can and make the smartest moves that based on the information we have today, but that there is this element of luck, or as Ilka you alluded to, the fact that these houses are close to enough to one another that they one a fire and one spreads to the next, and how do you deal with that? That question of zoning, I thought was also. I mean, you mentioned Ilka, New York, Vancouver. The relaxation of the setbacks was a really key piece of the Vancouver policy, the city of Vancouver in British Columbia, that kind of started to pave the way for the progress toward the step code in British Columbia, and all this progressive change. So that notion of like, hey, we just need a little bit more space to make these envelopes more robust and therefore more fire resilient, assuming we're using things like stone wool and other fire resistant materials. So there's some kind of territory that has been explored by other areas that hopefully Los Angeles can lean on a little bit.
And also it's true that they can lean on it. And then there's also getting the people who are the clients to appreciate, of course, the advantages of passive house assemblies in a climate such as LA. I mean, we touched on that a lot. It's challenging that at least one of his clients, but understandable that in the moment right now, all she wants is a house back to enjoy,
Yeah. Yeah.
would sound like, she's older and isn't that concerned about the fire resistant detailing or probably the zoning issues. All she wants is a house back to be able to enjoy. And I'm sure that that's going to be a big issue to deal with.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but that's essentially the story that we're going to be dealing with climate change, right? Like not just fire, but all sorts of other areas is just this resistance to, I don't want to have to change or do this extra thing to deal with recognizing this new reality. You could see that, with hurricanes on at the coasts and that sort of thing too. It's
right.
Tricky.
But particularly if somebody feels like I've got 5 years to live.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And yet the building's going to survive that person. So
yeah.
I think it's also just reacting in an emergency, right? It's
Mhm.
usually not really the best outcome. And I feel like this kind of story is the same back after the Marshall Fire, right? We actually went to Colorado and we visited the site, and there are very few passive houses being built after the fire, although the opportunity was there, right, to build better after it. But I think it's the same scenario where people just needed to have a home, right?
Yeah.
And in an emergency, it's never really the best time for decision making. So you better make decisions before it happens.
Right. It's almost like an expanded version of the heat, transitioning from a gas boiler to a heat pump. That decision happens under duress, often in the middle of the winter when your boiler has just gone out.
Yeah, that happened to me last year.
Yeah. That said, there is, I think, a growing awareness of the importance of fire resilience. And so I imagine that is on a lot more people's mind in Los Angeles, and that could potentially be a driver in a way that energy efficiency just hasn't been compelling in that marketplace. What do you think of that?
yeah, especially he mentioned, the advantages of when you're evacuating, if you have an airtight home, being able to at least minimize the chances that you're going to get smoke damage from the house, and that you can just close up your house and leave. And yeah, I think that's going to be a big selling point, because it's not just if a fire is coming to your neighborhood, but if there are fires nearby and other smoke events. So
Right. Right. And I mean, we here in Seattle and, the East Coast got hit, what it was the last year, the year before, with really bad smoke events too. Like the wildfires can be hundreds of miles away, and that actually can, you know, be relevant. Maybe not to smoke damage inside, but certainly to your health, not breathing in a bunch of benzene and other crap. So one of the new concepts for me from this conversation was this idea of sacrificial layers. And that came up a couple times, both with the cladding outboard of, say, a continuous layer of mineral wool, and also when you were discussing mass timber, and Michael mentioned the idea of oversizing the mass timber to allow for a layer of char so that once it withstood that, it would still be structurally sound. What did you guys think about that?
I thought that was really interesting as well, but I think it goes with the understanding that it's continuous, right? I think for me, even during that conversation, when we talked about this concrete building, but it didn't have the roof built out of concrete, so the fire just kind of came into the house through the roof. That was kind of a little bit of a new thought for me as well. So I think the idea of the sacrificial layer needs to, it just needs to be understood, or it only works if it's continuous, because what you're protecting is what's inside. So, and then you basically rebuild what was sacrificed, and everything inside is safe. So I thought that was really interesting as well.
absolutely. I mean, to be able to come back to your house and have, I'm sure, so your roof is gone, but, or, your stucco on the outside is badly charred, but you still have the structure and what's inside. That would be a huge deal to anybody who's gone through a fire.
Yeah, no kidding. Thank you for this, Ilka and Mary. Is there anything else you want to reflect upon before we wrap up?
I think just in general, the discussion about the ADUs, I thought
Yeah.
was really interesting too. I mean, it's something that I haven't seen much here of on the East Coast, although Mary and I were just talking about it. There seems to be a movement on the East Coast as well, and we're hoping to cover that in one of our next podcasts as well. But I haven't seen many of those here. So just talking about just what they do in terms of addressing the housing crisis and what you do with the land that you do have, but how it might contradict with the spacing of housing or houses, in case of a fire. So yeah, I mean, lots to think about.
Yeah, they're quite the darling in Seattle. We have similar policies, I think, to the ones that Michael was describing, with a limit of 1,200 square feet and pretty permissive rules around allowing them. So they're cropping up all over the place, and they're, referred to as an example of gentle density. And there's a lot, when you think about, sufficiency of space, and, they're great. We have this housing crisis, so it's definitely one piece of the solution here in Seattle. Fortunately, at this point, knock on wood, we're not worried about wildfire in the city, but who knows? How about you, Mary?
Yeah, I mean, ADUs, of course, are really interesting, and in California, they're a huge business. And it's the whole question of, for me, of can you build a model ADU for people in order to lower the cost of it, is very interesting.
Yeah.
Although from the little bit that I've heard from people building ADUs, it's tough because not every backyard is the same. So to be able to
Yeah.
fit a similar model in every backyard doesn't quite make sense. But it's
Right.
great way to address housing supply.
Right. Well, yeah. And you think it's a smaller house, so it's going to be cheaper, which is true. However, you're still involving all the trades. You're doing a kitchen, you're doing, bathroom or bathrooms. That has been the challenge for us at our house. It's just the cost is so high. Construction cost is very high in Seattle. So it hasn't become feasible. So I keep on dreaming that there will be, and I think it will happen. It's just a matter of time, of a prefab solution that could actually make it affordable. Of course, it has to work. It has to work on your lot.
But what is interesting though about the ADUs is that they're not the most energy efficient way to build,
No,
right?
no.
Or the
Yeah.
most cost effective, or
Yeah.
it's
It's multifamily. Multifamily is what we should, that's
I
the
mean, what
logical
happens,
solution.
what happens
Yeah.
in Germany a lot is actually that a lot of times the children of homeowners, they actually put additions to the parents, onto the parents' houses.
Yeah.
I've never really seen building another little house in the backyard. It's always just making what's there bigger. And maybe it's just a
No.
cultural difference, right?
No, right. I think that there probably is a bit of a culture difference with the wanting to have the, air around your envelope. I don't know why that's so important to Americans, but just in terms of the definition of ADU in Seattle, that it can be an addition. You could do an ADU as an addition. You can convert your basement to an ADU. The detached ADU, or DADU, is the term that people use in Seattle, is the backyard cottage. So that's one example. But it is kind of probably the more popular one at this point. It's interesting.
Right, and the idea of designing so that a small space seems really comfortable and makes optimal use of this space. I thought that was a really interesting point to touch on.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Don't waste your space in the bedroom.
Right.
In the bedrooms, yeah. Fantastic. Thank you again. This has been really great. I want to, on this theme of fire resilience, let people know about a big event that we have going on at the Passive House Accelerator and Reimagine Buildings, and that is our Designing for Fire Resilience Conference on March 14th. So this is where we'll be looking at this and examining, what do we do knowing that climate change threatens with frequent and devastating fires, and how do we create then fire resilient buildings that don't make the problem worse? So how do we make ourselves safe and resilient, and also build toward a more safe and resilient climate future for ourselves? So we have a bunch of great speakers lined up for this, diving into the real details that go into creating these fire resilient buildings, and how that can complement and be complemented by passive house design as well, and really looking at that with open eyes to understand where the limitations are and where the opportunities are. And half of the ticket proceeds for the conference will be donated to the California Community Foundation Wildfire Relief and Recovery Fund. So we hope you join us on March 14th. You can go to the passivehouseaccelerator.com website to get the link and sign up. And I think with that, we'll close it up. Thanks again, Ilka and Mary.